this lab in particular is a little bit more complex than our usual ones because it's sort of a passion project that we're working on is community activists that blend our work a little bit more closer to home, but also zooming out to the national level and trying to get an idea of the bigger picture. So we're going to talk about inequity analysis and equity analysis that we did here in Buncombe County. But also this is a learning process of understanding tax assessment policies and the bigger picture. So with that, today we have a couple very special guests. Larry Clark from who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives from the International Association of Assessing Officers. I met Larry about 10 years ago now at a national conference. And our analyst on the project, Dr. Ori Baber, who's been doing a lot of the guts of the work that you're about to see and the analysis. And so this is more of a pro bono volunteer project that we did to just tease the information and see what's going on in our community. And that's the result or the thesis of what we're talking about today. I'm going to introduce both their backgrounds first, and then I'm going to initiate the show. Ori's going to follow. I'll wrap up, and then we'll start our dialogue with Mr. Clark. But Mr. Clark is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the International Association of Assessing Officers. He's had decades of experience, including county appraiser at Wyandotte County, which is home to Kansas City, Kansas. Valuation systems for Johnson County, which is just south of Kansas City, Kansas, and more than 13 years at the IAAO, which is based in Kansas City. Larry's work at the IAAO promotes fair and equitable assessment, appraisal, and policy across the globe, and he earned his BA from Pittsburgh State University. And one of the other things that should be, and Larry will bring this experience in, but he's also on the Planning Commission in his community. Dr. Baber is an analyst with us at Urban 3, and he leverages his experience as data science to identify scalable planning practices that produce better urban health and vibrant urban economics. He's spent years working in redevelopment initiatives in North Central Florida. We actually met Ori in Gainesville, where he was working, and we worked with him on a project there. And he earned his doctorate in sustainable infrastructure and urban health from the University of Florida. So back in maybe a couple of years ago, and some of y'all have seen our work with redlining, but this is a map of Kansas City, Kansas, and showing the economic haircut that every district takes today, even though redlining stopped in 1968. So we applied that model, and we've done a lot of redlining work. For those of you that don't know redlining, or this is new to you, it happened in 1934. And then from 1934 to 1968, basically it was practiced in every community across the country. And it's when we changed mortgages from 7 years to 30 years that local communities had to make maps about where the investment would happen. So that was a federal system to basically force every community under or 50,000 population and greater to create a map of desirable neighborhoods. In green, best neighborhoods. Blue neighborhoods are still desirable, yellow are declining, and red is hazardous. The hazardous quantity was made by your percent Black population, and it didn't have to be a significant population. It was up to you to choose, but if you had to measure your Black population, which is the roots of racism. The next layer on this was your infiltration of immigrants. And in the 1930s, those were my people. Those were Italians, were the infiltrators that received some redlining. But for me, I could change my name and still pass as a white person. And for Black folks, they can't do that. So this is where the roots of that economic injustice is, and it happened here in Asheville. So this is our redlining map in our community. So the theory is that, well, sure, we stopped doing this. We stopped doing redlining, right? Well, when our community adopted, the city adopted a reparations resolution. The county did as well. Actually, the county did several. One was on public health. But the thesis of the roots of reparations is that, and this is straight from the quote from Sherry Beasley, disparities that exist as a result of policies, institutions, racism, and prejudice that remain stubbornly fixed and resistant to change. So do we have policies that are still in our system that are having racist results? So we took our method, which you all know, we're geo accountants. We're going to put stuff on maps and take a look at it agnostically. We're going to let the data drive those decisions. And we believe in being a data-driven group, but also our methodologies of looking at what's going on inside the system. Are there siloed practices that cause leaks? Is it tax policy? Is it zoning policy? Is it biased thinking? There's lots of things that are at root here. So this isn't any one nefarious person or any boogeyman. This is understanding how all these things are interrelated. So in our practice, we're going to diagnose land use economics with an apples to apples metrics. We're going to try to make things equal. We're going to understand the municipal standards and practice that results in subsidies. So any standards of practice could have a result. We're going to make things geospatial. We drive our information with maps and data. That's how we think. And then articulate the economic impacts of, it's called choice architecture, is that having policies in place just because they were here and we continue to use them, that's still a choice. So these are all choices, and how do we make this transparent for politicians to understand this? And finally, what are those increments that you can change along the way? So we'll just go back to home for a second. This is my house in Brown, the Brown house there. My neighbor is Black and a retired Vietnam War veteran in this white house right here, the Lordmans. So I pulled their property value. They're pulling about $500,000 of value per acre for their dirt, $127 a square foot for their building, 17% change from last assessment to this assessment. Going from the Lordmans over to Kimberly Avenue, this is a house on like the 9th hole facing a golf course. It's a spectacular Tudor house, big lot, underground utilities, phenomenal view, mountain, and a golf course. So if you just look at the property card, this is what you see, $130,000 of $500,000 house. But per acre, it's $450,000 an acre for the dirt. It's $107 value per square foot for the house. Let's just bring the Lordmans in. So you can see that the Lordmans are basically $20 more per square foot for the house. They're $50,000 an acre more for the dirt. And they're 20% growth versus 6% growth. You're paying about $1,000 more to the county in taxes per acre than that house on Kimberly. So going from Kimberly, which is a nice address, to what we all know in the mountains is the best stuff, which is up on top of the mountain. This is a house with a tennis court on top of the mountain. I love that. We all need a tennis court on top of a mountain. But when you look at its numbers and bring it in, you see that it's only $83,000 or $84,000 an acre for the dirt on top of a mountain versus the Lordmans at $500,000. You look at the taxes paid, they're only paying $5,000 in taxes versus the Lordmans at double per acre. And they actually have zoning for 6 houses up there. Now, there may be a bias in the system that apparently you can't build up there because it's steep slopes. Well, you can go and just look at the community up there and see that there's other houses that have built on small parcels. There's actually a bunch of them that have done so. And including the tennis court is flat, you could build on that. So to have a bias that, oh, you can't build up there is going to undervalue what that property is. We'll come back to this because, it's not that the assessors have an architect or a structural engineer on staff, but the communicating those resources is necessary in government because there's economic results. So this one gets valued at $84,000 and right next door, it's valued at $430,000. So that person right next door is paying 500% more taxes per square foot in their dirt. So if you tease through this, what you can actually do is there's actually tax maps that drive this, or tax neighborhoods. This is a map of those tax neighborhoods. So zooming into the top of that mountain, you can see where the problem is. That one parcel is its own neighborhood. Actually, this parcel and stepping down the mountain, that one, and that one, these are different neighborhoods than everything else is around it. So it's getting a different number inside the land valuation. That's going to have an effect as you go through the dirt. And you can see this stuff when you make the maps, it's visible. This is where our office is, walking across the highway here, going into Montford. You can see that fissure in the plan. So just looking at these two properties side by side, here they are. This one is paying, the dirt value is really super high in its value change. And right across the property line, you see this drop down. So we can use these maps to tease out and let the data show us where the errors are or what's going on. And then when we can see where those lines cross, we can say, well, why is this happening? What's inside policy that are making these tick? And then what's going on inside these broader neighborhoods? And are these tax neighborhoods the right boundaries? Secondly, we can look at practices where you can see in this neighborhood here, this is Shiloh, all of these tax neighborhoods are all level, right? Like aircraft carriers, they're all their own little plateaus. But you can see that in this neighborhood here, this tax neighborhood that's green, we clearly have two land transactions where the values popped up. So why hasn't the whole value of that one risen up like a plateau? So this is a question of policy. Is this policy practice? Is it standards? Is it behavior? We don't know. But we can see with the map clear as day that there's two different ways of handling this. And maybe it's at a more micro level, I don't know, but there's results to this. So looking at, let's take Donald Trump's attorney on the right versus Reggie Harrell's house in Shiloh on the left. Reggie's paying double the taxes. His house is $125 a square foot versus Sidney Powell's at $107 a square foot. Reggie's house is growing at 266% versus Sidney Powell's house at 126%. Now, Sidney Powell has 4 full bathrooms, 3 fireplaces. Reggie's just got 1 full bath in his house. So from a square footage standpoint, how is it that that number is so low on the Biltmore Forest side? And why aren't we asking these questions? Again, it's more of, this is just the results of math. So let's look at what's going on inside the math system. And I'm just going to jump ahead here. There's this article that came out in the New York Times. Many of you all have read it, and they have these things, we call them J curves, but basically looking at sale prices and what happens in houses. So in our community in Asheville, if you buy a house for $225,000, it's getting valued at $225,000. If you buy a house less than that, it's getting assessed higher than purchase price. If you buy a house more than that, it's getting assessed lower than purchase price. So there's a benefit to a more expensive house than $255,000. So our thinking was, well, if that's happening with the sale price, what's happening with every reassessment that happens thereafter? And we see this trend in our market or value of our houses. So this is taking a look at the quintiles of the housing. The lowest quintile, the bottom 20% of houses are growing at 300%. The highest 20% is only 130%. Now, this is a problem in our community because our income is down at 36% growth. So our housing growth is far exceeding what we can afford to pay. So when we talk about gentrification, a lot of that isn't just the ability for people to move into a neighborhood. It's also happening in how we reassess things. This is just the buildings. When you look at throw the buildings away and look at the dirt under the buildings, is even worse. It's like 700% growth for the lowest 20 and 100% for the highest. So this is the total value is a chart from the lowest quintile to the highest. This is the dirt value from the lowest to the highest. And what we would suggest looking at is what's the feedback, who is appealing the tax system. And what we find is people at the higher end are appealing their taxes more. So we're getting more feedback in the system from those that are at the higher end and less feedback from the lower end. So from the lower end perspective, there could be an assumption that well, people are okay with their tax assessment, and that may not necessarily be the truth. So let the data drive this. So back to the folks for a second. Here's our population in Buncombe County. We've got a lot of people that are poor that make household income of $10,000, $14,000, et cetera. For those folks that are in those buckets, this is what they can afford in the housing stock that currently exists in our community. So we should be evaluating how much stock we have versus our people and running the math on, is there enough housing for our people? So you can see that at the lower end, we've got a lot less housing stock for the people that need it. And to be fair, at the higher end, you have the same problem. So we're just not producing enough housing stock at either end of this spectrum. So usually what ends up happening is folks at the higher end, well, they can go shopping down and buy houses less than their market desire and throw money into it, grow it up. That's where gentrification happens. At the higher end, people can't go shopping upward. Now, the thing that's also we should be looking at, and this is as much our city as our county and all the towns in between, these are all the out-of-towners that own that housing stock, taking it out of the marketplace so that we can't get to it. That's no offense to any Floridians, but we have a lot of Floridians that own real estate here, and about 28% of our stock. And of that portion of folks, of out-of-towners, 1 in 5 are institutional investors, like a pension fund or whatever. We're not even asking that question. So what we find in our community is we're essentially playing checkers when there's a chess match going on. We're not asking these questions about what the market is, and I'm using air quotes around that, and how that's being driven without our own accountability from a zoning perspective, a planning perspective, policies, assessments. There's lots of things in the mix here. But back to the original thesis, does it affect Black people disproportionately more than white people? So this is just black and white, folks. Black is blue, white is green. And this is the housing stock that people in those races own. And you can see Black-owned households are majority owned between $60,000 and $90,000, and white folks are about $30,000 more than that. So going back to that J curve, and if we were to apply that and see who's in the penalty zone and who isn't, and just a real simple diagnostic, let's just look at that number. You can see that the majority of Black-owned households are in the higher assessment level. And that's the results of the math that's in the system. So 2.4% of Black households get increased their taxes over value or over market value or market purchase, where 17% of white folks get the benefit. So there's a majority of toward the white, skews toward white on this, but also in our demographics, the wealthy folks tend to be white in our community as well. But this has ramifications straight through. You can see it clear as day here, but also when you look back at the red line maps and you see the value changes happening more so in the red neighborhoods than the green neighborhoods. So this is Burton Street and Brucemont Circle are a particularly interesting case because they're only 2 blocks away from each other. And you can see 38% growth in Burton Street versus 17%. So those valuation effects, we'll just zoom into those 2 neighborhoods here. Here's Burton Street here and Brucemont Circle with the dirt value change at the bottom and the building value change here, percent white. So you have 90% white here versus 56%, and then Shiloh and Biltmore Forest. The key thing to look here is the dirt value change. You're getting a 4% change in Brucemont Circle versus a 54% change. You can see it in the model how it bumps up. But ultimately, you get this results that you can't not see it here when you look at the data, that there's a disproportionate growth in the neighborhoods of color versus the white neighborhoods. And again, this is more of, if it's happening, fine. How do we look at this, and how do we see that there's an unfair advantage, and how do we peel this apart? And so this is going to be the conversation to go on. It's like, there's what's happening here. How do we deal with this and have an honest conversation about it in a way that we can move forward as a community? And rather than just come up with a paycheck for reparations, how do we stop the disproportionate excessive taxes that happen on folks of color and lower wealth? So I'm going to turn it over to Ori here to take over the screen, and then I'm going to come back and we'll open the conversation with Larry. Ori, are you there?
I am, yes. All right, thanks, Joe. Thanks for the introduction. I think I'm gonna take a couple of minutes and revisit some of these graphics that Joe has presented, and perhaps unpack them a little bit more fully, and share some of the observations our team has had and internally, as well as talking with other folks about this particular data. And so the kind of big observations that I'm going to share are somewhat observations, questions, and perhaps little bits of kind of recommendations about things we might think about in this context of equity in our reassessment process. So the first one I'll take a look at is that housing distribution and median income for Buncombe County. And I'm actually just going to look at the cost of housing, or the housing value distribution here in Buncombe County. What we see here is that, a lot of the housing is stacked towards the middle. We've got, pretty robust housing stock in the 250 to 300 range. But that is not true on the kind of tail ends of this value spectrum. We've got fewer houses in the lower value end of the spectrum, and we've got fewer houses on the higher value end of the spectrum. And when we think about that from a standard kind of data analysis perspective, what we might expect to see in the process of assigning value to these homes is that in the case of having fewer homes to assess their value, it may be more challenging to accurately and validly approximate those values according to true market value, because there's less transactions, there's less actual sales going on for us to approximate true market value. And that's not necessarily as true in the center, where we've got more transactions, we've got more data to work with that can really build more of a confidence and reduce that uncertainty in assigning their market value. And then the other big piece here, when we think of kind of this big normal distribution, is that there's kind of a heavy weight in the middle. And when and if our math that we're using to assign an appraised value is done so using means or averages. So I'll give you an example: average price per square foot, or average price of a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in a specific neighborhood, right? What this ends up doing is that that center holds a lot of gravity, holds a lot of weight, and may end up pulling the tails toward it if we're using those averages in the process of assigning value. And so those two mechanisms in and of themselves, that kind of wiggle or uncertainty on the tail ends of those values, plus that regression to the mean, that kind of pulling in towards that gravity center, may have the effect of pulling lower valued homes up higher than perhaps they ought to be, and the reverse of maybe pulling the value of higher value homes down towards the middle. So this is then kind of the big takeaway message that I feel is important to just ask and kind of put out there, is what strategies and what opportunities are there to really kind of think through this and perhaps intervene to create greater certainty on these two tail ends? Is this more advanced math that needs to be put in place? Are these additional practices that need to go out and make sure that we're verifying, validating, and creating confidence in our ability to estimate those values? So math, right, practice, additional standards, additional policy around that to help fix the bell, right, is what I'm calling this. The other big layer to think about, Joe talked about the appeals process, right? And so we might expect, it might be reasonable to assume that if, with those the lower certainty on the tail ends of the value spectrum, that it might be reasonable to think we're not getting as close to true market value on the two ends of the spectrum. And so when those values are then sent to the community members, the property owners, there may be greater rates of saying, hey, this doesn't look right to me, let me readjust those through this appeals process. But what Joe showed is that really we're seeing the appeals happen on the higher end of the spectrum, and we're not seeing as much engagement in the appeals process on the lower end of the spectrum, right? So we end up having kind of two perhaps downward depressing forces on that tail end. So again, this kind of begs the question of, are there opportunities for additional practices or policies to help kind of create better balance in this particular scenario? And is this possibly part of the mechanics that's driving this J curve that we're seeing, which is lower valued homes being appraised higher than their market value, than the value that they're selling for, and the opposite being true, those higher value homes being appraised lower than they're selling for? Does this partially explain what we're seeing here? And so then if this is what we're looking at, a situation in which lower valued homes are picking up the tab for a lot of public services by paying a greater share of taxes, then it seems that the charge really needs to be flatten this curve, right? It needs to be a pretty big objective moving forward in whatever we do, right, to create equity and ensure equity across the board. In the process of doing that, though, I think it's going to inevitably require lifting up the hood on a lot of the math and taking a pretty deep dive into how we go through this process of assigning values. And I think one thing that I want to just emphasize is Joe showed this graphic where we see really stark differences across neighborhood boundaries. I'm being familiar now with Asheville enough to say that there's not a huge differentiation between houses in these two neighborhoods that would kind of conceptually lead to validity in calling these differently. I wonder what the impact of having these neighborhood boundaries is in the math, right? So we, kind of conceptually can say we've got housing stock, and the way we're doing this right now is to group houses according to neighborhood category, and then just let the math run within these neighborhood boundaries. I personally am concerned by this. I think my experience and my work has shown that inequity has a geographic component to it, undeniably, and perhaps in the process of using these neighborhood boundaries, are we codifying and perhaps reinforcing these geographic elements of inequity? And if that's the case, this really needs to be robustly thought through and create ways and strategies to help avoid reinforcing geographic inequities. And so I'm calling this the fixed neighborhood boundaries, right? How might we advance past using these somewhat arbitrary neighborhood boundaries, develop math and analytical strategies that help us pull relevant characteristics from across neighborhood lines, but do so in a way that also considers geography, right? Buncombe County is not uniform in its geography. We've got different topology, we've got different access to resources, zoning's different. How do we wrap all of that up into a strategy that's not as simple as just bifurcating homes into specific neighborhoods? And then that leads me into kind of the next big observation or conversation that I would like to see happen around all of this is, as the math and the capability to advance our analytical strategies increases in complexity, I think it's probably very important that our ability to communicate that complexity keeps pace with advancing technologies, such that we're not unintentionally hiding behind complex math, but we're able to kind of open the doors to folks that really need to remain engaged in the reappraisal process. And so what I've done here is just kind of broken down our county's schedule of values, which is a document that kind of underpins the reappraisal process here in Buncombe County. And this is one of the first documents that I turned to as we did this work. And what I saw is that this blue portion of this 655-page document, so over half of this document is presented in pure tabular format. And I understand the importance of that data and how it provides the mechanism for the reevaluation process. But unfortunately for me, and I feel like many other people, it's kind of irrelevant to be looking at data presented this way. It's very hard to glean any sort of meaningful or interpret any sort of meaningful information from this. So as we only increase in complexity of our analytical strategies to assign value, I think it's important that we keep pace and visualizing it and making sure that it's accessible. So just a quick comparison, right, between those data tables that we see and a visualization like this, I think we can see and more kind of critically interrogate those numbers a lot better when they're presented in a format like this. We can see those changes and ask those important questions of, does this need to be considered through a racial equity lens or an equity lens in general? So a key takeaway, key concept idea here is really to make sure that we keep it approachable and accessible. And then last one, and I'll turn it back over to Joe, is I think as we think creatively and innovatively about how to kind of move forward from here, it's important that we think about taking a systems approach, which is, there's probably one no single-handed solution or new way to do things that's going to work in a vacuum. But we really got to be thinking about kind of the different layers and facets and domains that need to be continuously engaged in all of this, all the way down from the individual property owners through to the community organizations and adopting new technologies, and what are the roles of the institutions and kind of guiding bodies here, and then really thinking about what are those supportive policies that can kind of have those downstream impacts all the way down to the reappraisal process. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Okay. Let's see. So where does this leave us now? When we started this conversation with Mr. Clark, it reminded me of when I first met him. And honestly, I mean, we're not assessors. Ori and I aren't trained in that, but we're trained in city planning, and the cash flow, the tax flow, is critically important to maintaining your city. And about 10 years ago, we made this map, and this is just the dirt value in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And you expect the neighborhood, the dirt per acre, to look like this neighborhood up here, where everybody in the same neighborhood is the same value. And we didn't know. We're just like, all right, well, that's what we expect. But you see over here, the dirt value is $15,000 an acre in blue. And when you cross the street, it doubles in value to 45,000. So it's the same zoning district, same school district, same police district, same everything. How is it that land doubles in value when you cross the street? And I actually went to the assessors and presented this, and it just is a curiosity. And I will say this, I was scared. I didn't know what to expect. Their magazine is called Fair and Equitable. And I asked, how is this fair? And how is this equitable? And to their credit, they said it's not. And I said, well, this has, 3 miles of streets around it. This one has 200 feet. And they said, we don't measure infrastructure. That's not what we do. So there's this disconnect of the infrastructure and the policy, but also this skews the market, right? If you give me more land, or if I take more land and more resources, why are you giving me a discount? So it was a bias that was baked in the system. They didn't know where it came from. And they said, I asked them, I'm like, did Moses deliver this? Like, where'd this come from? How does this happen? And it surely affects the market. And they all agreed with me. I was expecting a fight, but they're just like, no, you're right. You need to talk to Larry. So I talked to Larry about it, and Larry's like, yeah, that's kind of an interesting point that you point out. And you're right. It's not fair. It's not equitable. So I think that, putting the assessors organization on the side, we on the outside also have to take an open mind that it's up to us to get informed about this and also understand the situation that assessors are dealing with. So our assessors department, Mr. Miller, is dealing with 28 people on staff, only 12 of which are dealing with real estate, and he's got 127,000 parcels to manage. You're dealing with people doing real estate transactions where some of them are just off the books. You've got to track that down. We need to find out what's going on at the Register of Deeds. There's lots that are going on. So there's going to be some errors. So that's fine. But we need to find a way to move past that. And how do you help these, either put more resources toward this, but 10,500 parcels per person is not fair to those individuals that are working with this data. So I want to make sure that we all understand that point. And also for those folks that work in other departments and other silos of government, how often do you go and talk to assessors? How often does the planning department go and share data on zoning and help the assessors understand what's happening in the system? Otherwise, they're left to whatever they can handle inside their system. So with that, I want to bring Mr. Clark back into this and open up, he and Ori can open up our screen, our cameras, and I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to start a little conversation here. And for those folks, I know that we've blasted through a lot of data. Put your questions in the Q&A. I have a series of questions to start with Ori and Mr. Clark, and we'll get this conversation started. So with that, Mr. Clark, I want to thank you for joining us and dealing with our speed dating on property assessment mechanics. And we talked earlier, I wanted to start maybe with some takeaways as far as conversations that are happening nationally at the International Association of Assessing Officers with regard to some of the stuff that was raised here and what's happening nationally.
Certainly. And first of all, thank you, Joe, for inviting me to this webinar. As assessors, and I know I had the same reaction when Joe presented his evidence the first time, we tend to get very defensive. And I think that's just human nature. When someone appears to be attacking what we're doing, and especially someone who's not familiar with what we do, we take a defensive stance. And that was my first reaction to Joe, and also to reading Dr. Berry's paper, which has gained wide attention. I actually talked to Chris yesterday, and we had a nice conversation about what he has found and what he is hoping to do. And like Joe, Chris Berry is wanting to develop some tools to help assessors, because it's one thing to point out a problem, it's another thing to find solutions. And as my fellow assessors in the office and the audience would certainly attest, our problem can be summarized in one word: resources. If every assessment office had a PhD geoanalyst like Ori, had a PhD mathematician and a PhD computer scientist, and had enough staff to reduce the load down to about 5,000 parcels a person, they might be able to begin to address some of these longstanding problems. But we don't have that. And when I talk about resources, it's not just money and it's not just personnel. We also, all of us, are administrators of the law. And the law binds us in certain cases to do certain things that, if we were free to do something different, we would have different results. So it's a number of different areas that need to come to bear on this problem of assessment inequity. And unfortunately, as assessors, we're the first ones to get blamed, and people kind of stop there before going on to the other parts of the system.
There's a great point about the law. And just for folks that are from North Carolina that are on this webinar, our assessment methodology is, the politicians could choose to do it once every 8 years, which means that you eliminate the data for 8 years. Now that's going to put the assessor behind the curve for 8 years. Now our county has recently been keeping it a 4-year loop, but they do have the option to do it every single year. That would help the assessors get that data. There are some states where some communities we've practiced in, they haven't done a reassessment since 1983. That's Delaware, which is insane. So there is political involvement in this. And also, actually, Larry, could you maybe explain dark stores to people? Because I first heard about dark stores at the assessment conference, and this was like 10 years ago, and the assessors were going nuts about this. But in a nutshell, what's the dark stores? What's happening with big boxes?
Well, in a nutshell, some very bright lawyer came up with this idea that we should use the sale of abandoned commercial buildings as comparables to commercial properties that are active and in business. Well, there's a reason they went dark, and that reason may in fact affect their value. So most of the assessors, appraisers that I know shy away from using dark stores as comparables, but unfortunately there have been in some jurisdictions, the local authorities, the courts and quasi-judicial appeal boards have ruled against the assessor and in favor of plaintiffs who have brought this dark store theory. It's just one of the new ones. There's always something new coming up.
Yeah, and then and that's also, they're trying to get, I think it was Michigan was trying to get state legislation passed to just push it all the way down. I think that was the presentation that I saw. It's just, I think that we all need to be mindful of the it's a multi-pronged approach to being aware of this, and hearing that the assessors were at the lead of that 10 years ago, and people are now just finding out about it in the planning community. But that affects tax flow. As far as obviously we use Esri software a little differently than most people. But if you could maybe talk about the changes in technology that you've experienced and where you see the shape of things to come with technology in the practice of assessment.
Well, it's interesting that Joe had mentioned Delaware, because we're working with all 3 counties in the state of Delaware as a court ordered reappraisal. And where technology comes in is that one of the first questions we were asked by the plaintiffs in that lawsuit was whether they would have to undergo a physical reinspection of all the properties. Well, according to our standards, yes, they would have. And their question was, can we substitute imagery of some type? And we couldn't come up with a good response to that, other than In our standards, we require that you collect data on the entire property, and that's difficult through just imagery. I've since found out that there's a jurisdiction in New York that is allowing the property owner to take a movie of the inside of their house using nothing more than their iPhone and send that in, and that substitutes for an interior inspection of the property. So there are new technologies available, including imagery, including mapping. Many jurisdictions have started using maps in very imaginative ways. And we're, if anything, at IAAO, we're playing catch up all the time to the new technology. Of course, the latest catchword is AI, artificial intelligence. And we have a group of people looking into that and how it can be implemented to help assessors. Again, it gets back to resource. If we come up with the latest and greatest technology, that doesn't mean that immediately every assessment office is going to be able to use it. They have to have the resources available to make use of those technologies.
Well, and also that raises the next level, and we talked about this yesterday, but the as things get more complex, it also could have the tendency toward an opacity that makes it difficult to know what's happening. Could you expand a little bit more about how do you keep things balanced with complexity and transparency?
One of the issues we face, especially with some of the new technologies, and I'm talking about things like artificial neural networks. I have a friend, Rich Borst, who has done quite a bit of work in that area. And artificial neural networks will produce good values. Unfortunately, they don't produce a stable model. And we, in the assessment field, we have to defend our value. We have to explain to property owners what we did. And Rich has a difficult time explaining neural networks to me. I can't imagine sitting down with just the average taxpayer and explaining it to them. Plus the fact that if I have a property that goes up on appeal and it takes 2 or 3 years for that appeal to be heard, I have to be able to replicate what I did initially. And with some of this new technology, there's not that capability. And again, we talked not only of technology, but of some of the laws under which we work. We have legislators who, with the best intent in the world, make the system more complex. And the more complex the system is, with classifications and rebates and refunds and all the other things that they can come up with, it makes the system more opaque from the standpoint of, we as assessors develop a market value of a property. Well, then it may go through several steps before we get to the assessment and ultimately the tax bill. So how are we to explain to a taxpayer where their tax bill came from with all of this other complexity built into the system? It tends to make the system more opaque to the average taxpayer, and that's not a good thing.
Well, just in my experience as a planner, I would see the same in the zoning game, that you would get all, I mean, no offense to any land use attorneys in this webinar, but I have a real problem when you have land use attorneys steering zoning policy, because that's the game that they swim in. And it becomes so complex that everybody has to hire a land use attorney just to get through a zoning process. That's inequitous, because it makes it difficult for the regular, Jane and Joe to do something small and modest on their house, or buy a property and become a small infill developer. And it raises the price of entry in land use conversion just by complexity of the system. And the same becomes true inside the tax system. And since still on the complexity issue, do you find that there's a method of engagement that's been successful across the country where maybe there's a more collaboration between the assessment community and the non-assessment communities, like an engagement with planning staff or finance officers, or who's doing it in a way that's exemplary?
Well, the last jurisdiction where I worked, I thought the county appraiser there did an excellent job of engaging the community. He put together a group of people that consisted of fee appraisers, individual property appraisers, realtors, people who were involved in other aspects of the real estate community. Now, he tried to keep it small enough to make it workable. I'm talking about the number on the committee, but yet these were people that knew what was happening in the real estate market. And he went to them each year because we were on an annual reappraisal cycle, went to them each year, told them what he was seeing in the market and asked for their input. Are you seeing the same thing? Are there areas, and within each jurisdiction, there are a number of different markets, not just one. So are we missing something in some particular market? Whether it be overappraising, underappraising, are there things that we're missing? That's the sort of thing that was very helpful to us from several standpoints. Obviously, it helped us do a better job of appraising initially, but with those people in the know, it was very easy for them to go out because other people were contacting them and asking them what was happening in the market. They would tell them the same thing they were telling us. And we had a number of appraisers, for example, that people would come to them and say, well, would you challenge my appraisal for me? And I said, no, the appraiser's right on. He's hitting the values at least as close as anybody could. So that's one instance where collaboration was really helpful.
And actually, we're rounding the corner to our Q&A section. So for those of you that are online, start typing away. And Mr. Clark, you actually transitioned really well into a comment from a friend of mine, Michael Figueroa, who's has a successful real estate practice here in the community, but he's also a city planner. And Michael asks, does the most recent sale value of a home get used to adjust the value of a home in reassessment? So how is a recent sale transaction used at a macro level for reassessment?
Well, that gets back to Ori's presentation. There is no doubt that where the bulk of the values reside is what is going to pull the ship forward. When I was working in a local jurisdiction, one of my responsibilities was to update our depreciation tables every year. Well, I always began with the average grade because that's where I had the bulk of the sales occurring, and then work out from there, going to the higher graded properties and then down to the lower grade. And when it got to the very highest or the very lowest, it was a matter of making a judgment call because I didn't have a lot of data to back me up. So that's one way that recent sale will be used. The other is when we began setting values. Obviously, we're going to look at that recent sale and compare it to the value that we derived from developing valuation models to determine whether it's close, because one sale obviously doesn't make the market, but we can't ignore that altogether in each individual valuation. And we had the luxury of being able to look at all the individual values before they went out and were presented to the property owner. But it did have a great deal of influence. It was weighted heavily in the final decision.
Well, and Michael, since you asked this question, sorry to turn the table on you a little bit, but one of the things that, well, I know you locally, and I know you're deeply involved in the community and with the local Realtors Association, but going back to Mr. Clark's comment is, could we start having more with the Realtors Association, with CREA, having those conversations with Mr. Miller to bring that feedback from what's happening in the marketplace to our assessor in a more engaged way. And I know that you're involved with the local realtors, and that seems like an easy way to communicate. So don't mean to throw more at you. I know that you're way busy, but but for everybody that's on the call, in your local real estate industry, and your local real estate should communicate with the assessors and bring that information forward. Would be helpful.
Typically, we get bombarded by requests from our clients to fight the assessments for them when we get a reassessment. So it's the opposite of how we're engaging. It's usually our higher end clients reaching out saying, can you please talk this assessor down? But no, it would be great to engage on the front end before the assessments went out, especially as an industry. I think we'd welcome that.
Thank you. Another question that's come in, a question came in about land value taxation. And I know that that's been a conversation at every assessors conference I've been to. The Lincoln Land Institute has been fully involved in that. And the question is, what would be the potential inequities or impact if a land value taxation approach were used? Or would it exacerbate the problem? For those that don't know about land value taxation and Henry George, it's basically eliminating improvement value and just doing things more into the dirt value. We see that when we do work in Australia. They have a higher dirt value as a percentage of overall property value than we do in America. The obvious implications are it's geospecific. So you're going to start in an area and it's going to go out from there. But those closer to the center are going to be higher impacted. If you happen to be of low wealth and you're near that radius, you're going to get taxed more. So that's, I don't know, Mr. Clark, I don't know if you have more to add about land value taxation. There's blessings and curses that come with it, but no policy is going to be perfect.
Yeah, I don't think we could anticipate moving to that just because of the inertia within the current property tax system. And I have to admit that I'm not that familiar with places that have implemented it other than anecdotal evidence that, such as you just indicated.
Well, somebody's actually raised an interesting conversation, and I know that this has been part of a hot topic inside the assessors community. But Zillow, Redfin, the relationship of that industry versus the assessment industry. I know that you could probably do a 2-hour show on that, but what would be your feedback on that?
Well, one of the suggestions in Delaware recently was that we just use Zillow values. Well, there are a number of issues with that. In the state of Delaware, as you indicated, Joe, and I'm not leaking classified information. They hadn't appraised in a number of years. Zillow gets their information from local sources. So if they're using the assessor's data and we know the assessor's data is bad, why would we trust the Zillow values any more than the assessor's values? So that's one issue. The other is that I believe the people behind Zillow, the ones who are developing the models, have become very good at what they do. So there could be a way of collaborating with Zillow or CoreLogic or one of these other companies and make use of that expertise in a way that assists the local assessor. We haven't really gotten that far yet, but yes, it's an issue.
Mr. Clark, I wonder if from a practical perspective, if it doesn't need to necessarily be that the Zillow approach or Redfin approach replaces any sort of local efforts, but perhaps as another layer to check how the math is turning out from the local assessor's office, and if there are massive deviations between Zillow and local, perhaps that's a good kind of feedback loop to help then inform where are these issues coming up and these deviations happening. So just a thought.
There's been there's several questions that have come in with relation to BIPOC communities, the history of redlining, and you know, we have to be honest that for 30 years, certain neighborhoods were geographically boundaried and suppressed. So their market conditions have been skewed by the economic policies at a federal level, and that's going to affect how the market looks. And any changes in real estate from a neighborhood that's been traditionally underinvested, and then all of a sudden somebody goes in and buys in that neighborhood, the data is going to show a huge jump in that neighborhood. So how the math works is it's going to reinforce that cycle of gentrification. You know, the math is the math, and that's happening in the reality of the marketplace. Ultimately, this is a political conversation and a political solution. I think Durham, North Carolina, is one of the communities where they let the system run, but then they turn around and give a rebate into the system, because that's, you know, it's got to be ultimately legal at a state level. But that's one simple political solution. We would advocate that you have to look and take all of that stuff into context of the totality of the economic system. And I know that there's folks and past clients of ours and friends of ours in Kansas City and South Bend, where this is a top of the mind conversation. All of this stuff is tied together. But Mr. Clark, are there other examples of folks that have successfully moved the conversation forward to deal with gentrification and redlining, or any examples that you could talk about?
Well, first of all, the real estate community does not move rapidly in most cases. So the fact that we had redlining for 30 years, it didn't just go away. People didn't just suddenly move out of those communities into other areas. So we're still feeling the impact of that redlining. And the redlining, while discriminatory, pretty much set some boundaries that haven't gone away over time. Gentrification is starting to change some of that. And every time that I've experienced it through reports from assessors, it's been from a standpoint of frustration, because, and we talked about this yesterday, an individual may go into a neighborhood, and this is happening in Kansas City, Missouri, and start rehabilitating a number of houses. And there's even a show on HGTV, something about the home on the block or something like that. But anyway, and they start rehabbing houses. Well, as assessors will tell you, the neighborhood itself will tend to establish a certain level of value. And someone can come into a $200,000 neighborhood and build $1 million house, but it's not going to be worth $1 million in that $200,000 neighborhood. The neighborhood itself will tend to bring that value down. Conversely, as you get more and more houses rehabilitated, those will tend to raise the value of the neighborhood in the market. So we will see houses that may have sold for $200,000 last year, selling for $250,000, maybe $300,000, not because people did anything to the homes, but because the market forces are bringing that up. And it is very difficult to deal with, because assessors are tuned into the market and what happens there, and are ruled by that. So gentrification is a real issue for assessors to deal with. There is no policy answer to that.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I mean, we're at 2:00. We're gonna go ahead and this has been fun. I want to give a huge plug to the IAAO, and everybody should go to their conferences. I've said, Mr. Clark, I've said in the past that your conferences make a planning conference feel like Burning Man. Y'all are like so like mathletes. I've never seen an organization more ethical and responsible than the Assessors Conference. And I've never witnessed anything like it in my professional career. So anybody that's, please, any planner that's on here, any finance officer, any city manager, go to an Assessors Conference, experience what they experience and learn what they're learning. It's invaluable to the practice of municipal government to see this is the system and what they're constrained with. A lot of this is political, and the things that we can change as citizens and we can affect. So assessors are doing their job, and they're trying as hard as possible. And their mantra is fair and equitable, and that's they take that tremendously seriously. So with that, I just want to charge all of us as citizens to aspire to fairness and equity and do what we can to help. And I want to thank you, Mr. Clark and Ori, and thank everybody for attending this. And we'll see you next month. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.